কি সুন্দর।
Are these the Alps?
অ্যালপসের ফুটহিলস। এখান থেকে শুরু হয়েছে অ্যালপস।
So they're trying to rediscover now classical philosophy, classical art, and here you have this body type, the nudity, this exaltation of the beautiful human body, and all that that body is capable of doing. Well, I mentioned that he's very classical, but if he were to be a classical Greek or Roman statue, he'd be perfectly mathematically proportioned, and David is not. His head is very large, his hands are extremely large, and his feet are quite large. And Michelangelo did this for a very good reason. This statue, remember, was destined to go on top of the cathedral, 150 feet up in the air. People had to be able to see these parts of the body from down below. But why these three particular parts? His head, well, we'll start with his feet there. His feet stand for stability. In fact, this is a David who is on guard. Have you noticed? He hasn't won the battle yet, has he? Because what do you see in his hands? The weapons. He hasn't used them yet. He hasn't cast the stone yet. Stone is being held in that large right hand, which rests on his thigh, and the sling is up there in his left hand, over his shoulder. This is the first time we've ever seen David represented before the battle, and that's why it's kind of hard to determine that this is even a David. Those are the only two clues that we have that this is David. He's holding those weapons. We have lots of Davids in Florence. Donatello sculpted two. Verrocchio sculpted another one. We have scores and scores of David represented in relief panels and in frescoes. But this is the only David we've ever seen before the battle. We're used to seeing the victorious David. David who has a sword in one hand and usually the severed head of the Goliath underneath his foot. Or the David in the middle of the action, shown cutting off the head of the Goliath. This David's now on guard, and that's why you have those large feet. That's the sign of stability. He's not going to go anywhere. He's going to stand here and protect us. His large hands are strength, but they're also action, because he's holding the weapons in those hands. And his large head, David doesn't win with his brute strength, but he wins with his intellect and with his aim. This is the center of our intellect. Our brain is found up here. It's that brain that sends out the messages to the hands to complete those actions. David looks pretty relaxed in this classical pose, doesn't he? All you have to do, though, is look at his face. You see the concentration. You'll have to go over to that side a little bit later and take a look at him. You see that wrinkled up brow. He's looking off on that horizon, waiting for that Goliath to appear. Well, David, as you know, never went on top of the cathedral. After 1504, when David was completed, he was too beautiful. They didn't want to put him way up high in the air where no one would be able to appreciate him, so they decided to put him in a more significant place, out in front of City Hall. Which is also very interesting, because immediately you wipe out 90% of David's religious meaning. This is no longer so much a hero from the Bible, but he's a civic hero. Remember that David, I said, was commissioned by the city's government, which in 1501 was a republic, because the Medici family had been exiled from 1494, and they don't come back until 1512. So in this period in between, hey, these, what would it be, 16 years? 18 years? No, 16 years? They have a republic, and it's that republic that commissions David, and they decide to put it out in front of their city hall. So this now becomes a symbol of the republic, a symbol of freedom and democracy, which you have now in town, not this tyranny of the Medici family. They put him out in front of City Hall to guard over City Hall and to guard over the republic, to guard against the Goliath. Who's the Goliath? Medici family, all right? The Medici family is the Goliath. The Medici family do come back, and a lot of people ask me, well, why didn't they just destroy David if they knew that this was an anti-Medici figure? The Medici aren't dumb. They know that this is the most beautiful piece of statuary probably ever created up to that point. They also had a lot of ties with Michelangelo. Michelangelo had actually been adopted by the Medici family and lived with them. So he was almost like one of their sons, the rebellious son, the son who didn't agree with the Medici politics, although he loved the Medici for what they had done for him. So they're not going to destroy this piece, but they do come up with an answer for David. And that's the answer that you see when you go and look at the copy today. You have the copy standing in front of City Hall, and just to the right of David, you have the Medici's answer to David. Okay. After the Medicis became the Dukes of Tuscany, they asked Baccio Bandinelli, kind of a mediocre sculptor, but one of the court artists, to sculpt Hercules and Cacus. And there you see these two figures, Hercules standing up there with all of his muscles, and poor Cacus on his knees. Hercules has a club in his hand, and he's about to club Cacus in the head. This is the Medici's way of saying, we're now in Florence, and we're back. We're now in power. We are Hercules, and the man underneath our feet is the Republic of Florence, who has to submit to our rule. And if he rises up against us, he's going to get it, isn't he? He's going to get in trouble. So you see this beautiful political play then going on between these two figures. We also know that this is an anti-Medici figure by one of the breaks. You notice in that left arm, it's holding the sling. It's broken here at the wrist and once again at the forearm. That happened in 1504 as they were moving David across town. The Medici supporters came with stones, threw stones at David because they knew what this was a symbol of. And they succeeded in breaking this arm. There's a couple of other breaks, that right hand, and do look at that right hand. We know beyond a doubt that Michelangelo studied anatomy in a very physical, tangible form. By looking at that hand, you can see all of the veins in that hand. You can count every little wrinkle that he has in his knuckles here. Michelangelo, you know, did study anatomy, which back in those days was also a taboo. No one, besides a doctor or priest, could touch a corpse, let alone dissect it. Well, Michelangelo was invited in by some of the friars at the Church of Santo Spirito to come in at night with his candles and his sketch pad. He would dissect these bodies being prepared for the funerals. He would sketch everything he saw, so he knew how bones and muscles and ligaments were laid out in the body. He knows how muscles rotate and move. And here you have the fruit of all of those studies, The David, who is anatomically perfect. He looks like he's about to take a breath. You see that large right hand? The middle finger there was broken off 200 years ago on accident as they were moving David into the museum to preserve him a little bit better. The most recent break then is also the left foot. Foot juts out a little bit farther. You notice there at the toes, that's a reconstruction. It's a little bit darker. This happened only 4.5 years ago. A man came into the museum, visitor, with a bag over his shoulder. There was no protective glass around David at the time. And in that bag he had a hammer. Took the hammer out and started smashing away at David's foot. Not even David, I guess, can protect themselves from all the lunatics and maniacs around. They do. He's in a nut house somewhere because he wasn't quite all together.
How long did he take?
3 years, 1501 to 1504. But that's not 3 years working on David every day. He had lots of other projects going on. So he would work on David for a few days, maybe a few weeks, leave it, work on something else. You also had to take weather into consideration because this was being carved outside. So probably about a year's time, but spread out over 3 years, a period of 3 years. All right. Let me tell you now how Michelangelo goes about sculpting something like this from a rough block of marble. Let me take you back here to some of his unfinished works, and I'll help explain that a little better. Just my group.
You did out there.
Here you have a rough block of marble. You still see it? That was carved out of those mountains of Carrara. Michelangelo would personally go to Carrara and choose his blocks of marble. He only does not do it in a couple of instances. The David, for example, because the David, you know, that block was already here. And in another piece that I'm going to tell you about very shortly. Michelangelo was a very, very good judge of marble. He grew up with stone cutters, and he knew how to judge the quality of marble by looking at the outside. So he'd almost always go and choose his own block. Of course, then he would look at this block and he would imagine what could be inside there, what could be trapped inside that block. He'd make a few preparatory sketches maybe, and then he'd pick up his tools. No Black & Decker power tools back then. Everything done by hand. He had a hand drill, different sized chisels, and a hammer, and that's about it. You see here this curvature of the torso, you can still see where the block ended. That's a large chunk of marble to carve out, and he wouldn't get his chisels and carve all of that out. He would take his hand drill. And so very important now that we're going to go into the next room to talk about Michelangelo. It's very important to keep in mind that he did not do anything like this. He didn't have to make models to carve from, and that's what makes him so unique. And Michelangelo would start with a block of marble. He would look at it, he would imagine what could be inside of that block of marble, then he'd pick up his tools, after maybe making a few preparatory sketches but no models, he picked up those tools and he would start carving this piece, keeping it all up here in his head. That's what makes him so unique. So let's now go into the next room. I want to take you straight down to the David, tell you about David, 2 other works by Michelangelo, then I'll give you some time to go back around. What are you doing? Yeah. Let's see. Copy of him up there on the hill this morning, but it's nothing like standing in front of the real thing. Let me give you a couple of facts about David. He stands 13 feet tall. Okay, that's from just under where his feet is, because he's of course up on a pedestal. Just under where his feet are up to the top of his head. 13 feet tall. He weighs 19 tons, and he was carved out of one single block of marble. That was quite a block of marble. We actually have a history behind this block of marble. This block we know was brought from the mountains of Carrara, which are just north of Pisa along the seacoast. These are mountains made out of almost solid marble. The Italians today still carve out of those mountains every single year about 1.4 million tons of white marble. And they ship that all over the world. So if you have some white marble at home, chances are it comes from Carrara. Well, this mammoth block was brought to Florence by way of water. So first, they hauled it down from the hills on these carts. They put it on a small barge along the seacoast and then up the Arno River, because you remember that was navigable. And we know that that block was here about 30 years before Michelangelo was even born. Long time. It was given into commission to a couple of different artists during that period of time, but none of these artists started the block. We don't know exactly why. Maybe they weren't quite sure of their projects. Maybe they didn't feel capable enough of carving this block of marble, and they didn't want to ruin it. So both of these artists abandoned their projects and abandoned this block. This block was out behind where the cathedral is today. Back where you have the courtyard of the museum of the cathedral, that's actually where David was carved. This block had just been abandoned there until 1501, when Michelangelo receives a commission from the city's government to carve a David to go atop the cathedral. And we know that it never goes on top of the cathedral, right? It goes out in front of City Hall. But before I explain why, I want to tell you a little bit about David. We all remember David, right? The story of David and Goliath from the Old Testament of the Bible. Of course, David was a very young Jewish boy, probably only about 14 or 15 years old. And this young boy, what is his claim to fame? He defeats the giant, the Philistine Goliath, was coming to wreak havoc on his town and his people. Well, how was a little boy supposed to defeat a giant? Not with brute strength, right? What does he do?
He uses a sling.
That's right, he has a sling, which isn't a slingshot with a rubber band on it, huh? It's a big long strap with a pouch at the end, and he's gonna put a rock in there, he's gonna twirl it around like this, and he'll launch it, he hits Goliath in the head, he falls to the ground unconscious, and David comes along with his sword and cuts off the head of the Goliath. He saves the day, he saves his people, he saves his city. So he's the hero. This is Michelangelo's interpretation of David. Doesn't sound exactly like the David I just described, huh? He's not a 14 or 15-year-old boy, but a full-grown young, huh? But a full-grown young adult man, huh? He looks like he could probably hold his own against any giant. Also, there's nothing really explicit about him. Let's move up. That tells us he's a David. Nothing explicit that tells us he's Jewish. How do we know that this is a David? Because he looks very classical, doesn't he? This could easily be a Hercules or an Apollo.